This is TWiT.
So this has gone on for a long time, and I don't know how I feel about this. Just like I didn't know really how I felt about Edward Snowden. And it doesn't help, by the way, that Edward Snowden is now living in Russia happily. But Assange is now a free man. He did a plea deal, pled guilty one count of espionage in court on Wednesday. And they said the 5 years that you've been in detention in the UK counts, and you're free. But he did have to plead guilty to this one count of espionage. His followers and friends, he was the guy who ran WikiLeaks. And the reason he got in trouble was WikiLeaks published what turns out probably was a Russian hack of the Democratic National Committee's email. And it looks like, in fact, his cutout was Guccifer, who has since been identified as a high-level operative in the Russian military intelligence, who gave him this information. And there's even some question about whether he solicited this information. He's been trying to he's been trying to avoid extradition from the UK. This is one of the longest-running national security investigations in U.S. history. Assange, despite pleading guilty, denies the accusations. WikiLeaks wrote in a statement posted to X, Julian Assange is free. He left Belmarsh Maximum Security Prison on the morning of June 24th, having spent 1,901 days there. The case centers around publishing more than 750,000 stolen U.S. documents by WikiLeaks between 2009 and 2011. Organizations like the Committee to Protect Journalists have warned for years that prosecution of Assange could imperil the ability of journalists to obtain and publish classified information. And you may remember that just before this email release, WikiLeaks published video that showed that the United States had targeted civilians with its drone attacks. I think that was that Reality Winners material that she handed over? I can't remember. Both Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton have attacked Assange. WikiLeaks published a trove of emails in 2016 stolen from the DNC. It won Assange praise. I'm reading from a Wired story on this from right-wing figures, later revealed to be the work of notorious Russian hacking group Cozy Bear, affiliated with Moscow's GRU military intelligence. What do you guys think? Assange, a legitimate journalist pursuing journalism and persecuted, not prosecuted by the United States government for doing so, or a willing or unwilling, witting or unwitting dupe of Russian intelligence?
Possibly both.
Or both.
Because, so the journalists are concerned because it depends what he was doing. There's this old case, and it's actually not that old. There's a case that currently exists called Bartnicki versus Vopper, and that is a case that stands for the proposition that you can report on information even if that information was wrongly obtained, but it wasn't wrongly obtained by you. So one of the open questions with what was going on with Assange was, is what he published something he was publishing entirely as a journalistic function of information he was provided to where he had nothing to do with its sourcing, or was he too direct with the sourcing and having engaged in illegal behavior that generated the information that then he reported on? And it is possible that in the course of his career, both things have happened. So the journalist concerns are completely valid for when he's just a neutral and he's legitimately doing reporting and he had nothing to do with illegally sourcing material. You don't want prosecutions to happen to punish that sort of reporting. With his record, it was a little less clear that all of the reporting he truly did as a neutral intermediary who happened to have somebody else sourced it and just gave it to him with no conspiratorial contribution by him. I don't think we know. I guess we'll never know, but that's sort of the tipping point of whether we don't know how we feel about Assange, because some of it depends.
Right.
Depends on what the facts are.
Yeah, and I don't know if we know the facts. It's perfectly possible that the U.S. government scapegoated him.
I think both things have happened, but there's also the argument that the government scapegoated him just because it was so embarrassed and so upset. And I guess my question is, how legitimate was the scapegoating? Like, was it pure scapegoating, or did they actually have a leg to stand on to actually complain? And I'm not 100% confident in my own government's zealous pursuit of him. But on the other hand, I'm not entirely confident with how Assange has comported himself, so there's a part of me that thinks maybe the government did have a leg to stand on. I don't know. It's probably going to be completely dissatisfying for both parties. So in a sense, this is just as well, because otherwise now it's resolved. Now we can move on. But yeah, it's hard to get a feel good out of any of this.
The video, and I got it wrong a little bit, from 2009 was WikiLeaks called it collateral murder. Showed a crew of an Apache helicopter shooting a wounded Reuters journalist. An anonymous U.S. military official confirmed the authenticity of the footage. So that was legit, right? That was something that was a war crime, in effect. Admittedly, a war crime that the United States committed. But I'm not such a patriot that I think, oh, that's fine. So I think that was legitimate journalism.
I think he definitely has engaged in some legitimate journalism that has been unfairly targeted. I just don't know if all of the quote-unquote journalism he did falls into that category, or if there are allegations that have sounded reasonable about him being a little bit too close. But on the other hand, maybe it's also something that we don't really know, and I think if we had to have a tipping point, I'd rather have journalists have a freer hand, even in sort of the gray areas, than what happens if the journalists don't have as free a hand. I think journalism takes a hit, the free press takes a hit, the First Amendment takes a hit. I'm always going to go on team. I'd rather have too much protected than not enough protected.
Yeah.
Any thoughts, you guys?
Also kind of crazy
when you talk about like law enforcement in general, right? This is something that was talking about just yesterday. Sometimes you have any law enforcement thing in any particular case where the person jumps to conclusions based off of their experience. There's other times where that person just jumps to these conclusions because there's just a heavy-handed, like, hang 'em high type, Judge Dredd type person. They just want to take everything out. And the horrible part is when a case fits in a situation where everything lines up directly in the middle of that. It could easily be said with pure accuracy, this person that's in the Leo is not you, Laporte, is jumping to conclusions and making assessments and just want to hurry up and wrap this case up for optics. But then the person who's, quote unquote, did something wrong, they did enough shady stuff to deserve somewhat of a heavy hand. So it's hard when that sits sort of right in the middle and there's not a key case of over-enforcing and there's not a key case of caught red-handed. And those always are the worst cases. But I do think it's better to, even if he was scapegoated, it's better to at least put light on some of this stuff. But yeah, I kind of sit with Kat. Like I'm deeply conflicted.
Also, I want to correct myself. That video was not leaked by Reality Winner. That was the Chelsea Manning leak, and of course she served time for that. And her sentence was commuted, I think, by President Obama.
I'm sitting here trying to. It's hard to imagine that this was all that long ago. First of all,
I know.
This all took place back then.
15 years ago.
I would say, I agree with, as somebody who was a journalist for a long time myself, I obviously kind of err on the side of protection of that side of the world. Also, the idea that, hey, maybe we did all these bad things, but you obtained the documents illegally doesn't really hold a lot of water for me. Like you can both break the law and he can be held responsible for that, but also it doesn't take away from the severity of any of the actions that were taken. Right. And so I think that needs to be considered as part of it.
An example from my own youth is the Pentagon Papers. Daniel Ellsberg leaked those to the New York Times, revealing what the United States had been doing in Vietnam. Ellsberg may have committed a crime in leaking them. Chelsea Manning may have committed a crime in leaking that video. She served time. But that doesn't, if the journalist, it's my understanding, the rule is if the journalist doesn't suborn that crime on the part of Chelsea Manning, doesn't go to Chelsea Manning and say, hey, can you get me that, but does receive the information and publishes it. The New York Times was never prosecuted for the Pentagon Papers, even though Nixon wanted them to be.
I think there's two levels of what do we do about situations like these. One is the situation of that what you just described, that some intermediary has sourced the information and then handed it to somebody else who had nothing to do with the sourcing of the information and just published it.
Right.
And I think in those instances, it should be clear that the journalists who publish it really shouldn't end up in trouble for it.
That's not a crime.
But then there's the second question of, well, what about the people who are sourcing this information, liberating this information, acquiring it in other ways? Because to some degree, they may be doing a public service because it may be revealing bad things that the public needs to know about. And I think that's a tougher call. Because
I agree.
in some of these instances, I'm very glad it did get exposed.
I think Chelsea Manning did the right thing.
But what is the principle that scales where we don't have just everybody going to lunch or going to town and then...
Same thing with Edward Snowden. I mean, he revealed a lot of stuff that was very embarrassing to the NSA. Yeah. Was he a hero or a goat? There's still debate over that.
Well, one of the issues that did come up with Edward Snowden is that releasing it wasn't his first choice. It turned out he had no other avenue.
He tried, I think, really hard to do the right thing.
So
in
I
every
think from a policy standpoint,
yeah.
If you don't want everybody independently sort of taking everything into their own hands and posing their own judgment, which may be wrong,
right.
You do kind of need a mechanism for, well, what do you want people to do instead? And I don't know if we'll ever be able to have a perfect one, but I don't think at the moment we have any. We don't seem to have any sort of framework for this or any coherent response to these types of issues.
Right. It was the assertion of the government that, and there were chat logs indicating that Assange had actually had a conversation with Chelsea Manning and actually showed her how to exfiltrate the data, asked for that data. So this was the government's position, was he was complicit because he provided her with the information she needed to get the information out.
I think I'd also want to see that the government had a coherent framework for why it would be okay to go after Assange, but don't worry, it wouldn't translate into going after any other journalist.
Right.
And I don't think none was getting articulated in a way that the public could be confident in.
And I think your first point is still the best point. We don't know the whole story,
right.
And we probably never will know the whole story.
Unless somebody leaks it.
Ooh. You could leak it to me. I'm not asking you to. I'm not saying you should. I'm not telling you how. But if you wanted to, I'd be here for you. Actually, we do that all the time. A number of our panelists give out their signal number or ask for tips. Paris Martineau has her signal number in her lower third. So that people can give her tips. And she says she gets quite a few tips from the TWiT crowd. You guys know stuff, don't you? In fact, I know we have a lot of people in intelligence who listen to our show, and a lot of intelligent people as well. Cathy Gellis, speaking of intelligence, is here, attorney, and she is admitted to the Supreme Court, so she can go.
Write briefs.
You can write briefs. She does, in fact, for the Copia Institute, which is an arm of the Tech Dirt, and does some very good work. We're really glad to have you here explaining what's going on in the court system. Doc Rock, the purplest of them all. He actually, we should give you credit because you served our nation as a medic, yeah. In was it Afghanistan or Iraq? I can't remember.
No, I'm older than that, Leo.
Was Korea? Was it Vietnam? Where?
Germany.
Okay, not that old either.
Anyway.
I'm the mid '80s, so I went to Grenada but not fight, but I went there and I went to Kuwait. But yeah, anyway,
Kuwait. There you
the
go.
funny thing,
Kuwait.
The purple is because of Alzheimer's.org.
Nice.
Like
Support
I said,
that.
I deal with. Yeah, so that's the reason why I have purple everything, and I love Prince.
We walk in the Alzheimer's walkathon. My mother-in-law passed from Alzheimer's. My mom now has been diagnosed with it, and I know it's on my list of things to do. So I appreciate the purple, and I think you're absolutely right. Let's support research because this is one I think we can beat. YouTube.com/Doc Rock, and thank you for your service, of course. And Ryan Shrout, who is now on AirPods, much to his dismay.
Yes, very much so.
Signal 65 is the new job. What do you do at Signal 65?
So a lot of what I was doing before I went to go work at Intel, right? So kind of independent third-party testing and validation of PCs, data center products, software services, things like that.
I think that this is such a skill, and it's so, you see so many YouTubers putting their laptops in the freezer to see if it's faster, things like that. That really knowing how to do these benchmarks, really knowing how to test hardware and software is so important and so valuable. And that really is
your
a skill.
laptop will be faster if you put it in the freezer.
It will.
That it is.
It's harder
not
to
very
type
usable,
on,
but it is faster.
Yes,
Yeah.
it's faster, but the keys don't work as well. But you know,
Yeah.
Signal65.com. Great to have you. Hey, thank you for watching this little snippet from our big show, the News Roundtable, This Week in Tech. I'm Leo Laporte. Each week we cover the week's tech news, in-depth analysis, but it's also fun and engaging. You'll find it at twit.tv along with all of our shows. And if you want more, just hit the subscribe button, and we'll be sure to bring you a lot more great content. Thanks for listening.